People have questions or comments or even disagreements? I think anything. I didn't actually become an activist initially around LGBT issues exclusively. I was telling people earlier, I became a Palestine solidarity activist. I am Jewish, but I'm a fallen Jew. But I went to Israel as Zionist in the early 80s, and I left a very confused person, and I happened to be fortunate enough to encounter a bunch of people who introduced me to Edward Said, the brilliant Palestinian-American writer, academic, who unfortunately died a few years ago of cancer. I read some Noam Chomsky, and then when I discovered Marx, I decided not only am I not a Zionist, but I'm not an imperialist, I'm an anti-imperialist, and it led me to a lifetime of activism around social and economic justice issues, and I became a socialist and never turned back. So my involvement in this march and this movement and my ability to sort of put together a book like this was really as a result of many years of having been active in many struggles and spending years of studying and reading and debating out ideas along with many, many other people.
What's so appealing to you about socialism?
You mean, why would I turn away from a system based on rapacious greed, racism, imperialism, and war to embrace a system based on human need? That question? Did I just answer it? No, in all reality, I think, and one of the things I actually do go into in the book is we've been sold a bill of goods in this country about what socialism is. That it's some sort of, place, some sort of existence where we all wear, I don't know, burlap bags and, stand in size order or something and salute some picture of an old man on a podium, which seems an awful lot like the system we live in. But really, I think that one of the things I go into in the book is to sort of revive the actual liberatory core of Marxism and take on the fallacies of Stalinism, in other words, what existed in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and Maoism, the variants of Asia, and or Cuba for that matter. The various systems and societies that have used the verbiage of socialism to justify exploitation, continued oppression, and all the rest of that, to me, have done a great disservice. And I have no trouble with them, and I really take on, and really sort of unearth, what is socialism for real? And what is its history beyond the legacy that people are somewhat familiar with in terms of the Eastern European states and China and what have you, and sort of draw a distinction between those societies that have nothing to do with socialism, in my opinion, and everything to do with sort of kind of state capitalist economies, and actually talk about what is at the core of Marxism or socialism, which is essentially that the people who produce the wealth in society ought to control and decide how that wealth is distributed and used, and that we could live in a society without borders, without wars, and without the kinds of oppressions that grind us all down and force us to lead rather asphyxiating lives.
What kind of challenges have you faced ever since you started your work for LGBTQ within the community, the activist work?
It's a funny question. When I was active 20 years ago in ACT UP and stuff like that in New York around AIDS activism and various other kinds of political activism in LGBT community, there was still such a hostility to socialist politics because of this sort of distorted history that many people get, either from school or from popular media or whatever. And of course, people of my generation were far more heavily propagandized against socialism than people who were 20 because, because of the obvious, because the Eastern European countries fell, so they needed to propagandize against it much more heavily 20 years ago. But in any case, it was actually quite the biggest hostility I had was from other people in the movement. And it was actually quite an anti-organized left movement, the AIDS activism. And much of the movement's earlier incarnation, which is to say the late 60s and early 70s, which I'm too young to have played any role in, I was a toddler, was actually much more embraced, much more openly, left-wing ideas. For example, the first gay organization that came out of the Stonewall riots called itself the Gay Liberation Front. It actually named itself consciously after the enemies of US imperialism, the National Liberation Front, which were the opponents of the United States in Vietnam, what the US government derisively refers to as the Viet Cong. Their formal name was the National Liberation Front. And so the Gay Liberation Front was named in homage to them. And yet, 20 years later, it actually, or less, 20 years later, it became this sort of much more narrow, conservative, much kind of more corporate-oriented movement, even though it had a certain irreverent in-your-faceness to it in terms of the AIDS activists. It adopted a number of political ideas that were actually fairly narrow-minded.
Do you think with the current momentum of the movement, do you think that Obama will live up to, are you confident that he'll live up to his promises?
I think there's nothing inevitable about social progress. I do think right now, as a result of the modern movement and as a result of the current protests, it is inevitable that Don't Ask, Don't Tell is going to go by the wayside because the generals cannot support it any longer, the troops don't defend it, we don't defend it, and it's actually hampering their imperial adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq. Neither of which I support. And I was saying to people earlier, I think that, so I think some of these social justice gains will be made because this movement has made it impossible. I mean, they even sound, they fumble around and try and defend this policy. When the administration can't even defend its own policy any longer, it's a dead policy. Plus, frankly, I think they're just as happy to have queer boots on the ground as anybody else's. Even though, I both support getting rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then I think nobody should serve in that goddamn military. I really don't. I mean, I don't support any of the things that it does. I don't support any of its aims, any of its aspirations. I oppose US imperialism with every fiber of my being. I think anybody who is progressive ought to. And that is what the US military exists in order to do. And it's not about opposing the individuals who, out of economic necessity, feel that they have no other alternative but to join the military. That speaks to how we have to change, so much more in this society that gives creates the only option for many working class and poorer people, that the only place they can go to get, 3 squares in a bed is to go into the military, which just tells you how, exposes some of the bankruptcy of the way our society works. But then in terms of, I'm with Howard Zinn, the historian, on this question about Obama and politicians generally, that it's not so much who's sitting in the White House, but it's who's sitting in the offices, sitting in the cafeteria, that we have to, that what determines policy from our vantage point, what is going to actually shape policy in our direction is going to be through the conscious, organized efforts of progressives mobilizing. That's what has always been able to make changes in this country, and I think the same will be with a liberal in power as it would be with anyone else. And I think that, the one good thing is that people actually have enormous expectations and aspirations have been raised, and the fact is these things are not going to be delivered without a fight. I mean, we can see it with the healthcare plan. We're now being sold an absolutely miserable reform, and told that this is somehow akin to what we want, and yet it has none of the content of single-payer universal health care, which is what 70% of the population of this country wants. One of my great hopes out of this movement is that other struggles will take a page from the LGBT struggle and begin to mobilize to fight for genuine health care and for more jobs and all the rest of it.